Welcome to The Explainer. The war in Gaza that kicked off on October 7th is, without a doubt, one of the most complex and divisive stories of our time. So today we're going to do what we do best. Use the data, look at the sources, and really try to unpack the key events, the staggering human cost, and all the clashing narratives that define this conflict.
All right, so to really get a handle on this, you have to go back to the beginning. Let's start with October 7th, because that's the day everything changed. It was the attack that really set this whole war in motion.
So this is the number that just sent shockwaves around the world. On that day, Hamas and its allies launched this massive surprise attack on southern Israel. And the result? Over 1,300 people were killed in just one day. To put that into perspective, it was the single deadliest day in Israel's entire history.
And the attack wasn't just about the number of people killed. It had this other, just devastating element. Hundreds of people were taken hostage. And right away, that created this whole other crisis running alongside the fighting. It's been an absolutely central and, frankly, agonizing part of this conflict from the very first day.
But of course, something this big doesn't just happen out of the blue. It didn't come from a vacuum. To really get what's going on, we have to zoom out and look at the decades of history that led right up to this moment.
Okay, so this timeline isn't the whole story, obviously, but it hits four really crucial turning points. Let's walk through it. First, you have 1948. The State of Israel is created. This leads to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an event they call the Nakba, which means catastrophe. Then, fast forward to 1967. The Six-Day War ends with Israel occupying the West Bank and Gaza. Then, a huge shift in 2007. Hamas takes control of Gaza, and in response, Israel and Egypt start a blockade, which really choked off the movement of people and goods. You can see how each of these moments just added another layer of tension and complexity, creating the situation we have today. So, after the attack on October 7th, Israel declared war. And what came next? Well, the consequences have been absolutely devastating, especially for the civilians living in Gaza. The human toll in Gaza is just staggering. We're looking at figures from the United Nations here, and the number of fatalities has soared into the tens of thousands. And a really important thing to keep in mind is that this isn't the final number. It's constantly being updated by the agencies working right there on the ground. And it's not just about the death toll. The war has also created this huge displacement crisis. Think about this. At its peak, over 1 million people had to flee their homes. That's a huge chunk of Gaza's entire population, all forced to move, creating this massive internal refugee crisis. And the problems just keep spiraling outwards. It goes way beyond the fighting itself. What humanitarian groups are calling it is a total collapse of the basics. We're talking about hospitals being heavily damaged, water and power systems just not working anymore. And because of all this, UN agencies have been sounding the alarm about a looming public health catastrophe. Things like acute malnutrition, which is hitting children the hardest. Okay, so this brings us to another battlefield, one that's not fought with guns. It's a battle of words, of laws, and of stories. It's about international law, these competing narratives, and really the struggle over how the rest of the world sees and understands what's happening. So you'll hear this acronym thrown around a lot, IHL. It stands for International Humanitarian Law. And what is it? Well, you can think of it as the rules of war. It's a set of principles that are supposed to protect civilians. The big ideas are you have to distinguish between fighters and civilians, and you have to allow humanitarian aid to get through. Now, based on those very rules, both sides are facing some really serious allegations of war crimes. You've got international bodies looking into Hamas for targeting civilians and taking hostages, and on the other side, they're investigating Israel for things like using disproportionate force and blocking humanitarian aid. Now, this is super important. These are all allegations. They're still being legally investigated. Now, let's talk about how different people see this, because not everyone is looking at it the same way. It's like people are wearing different glasses or lenses. First up is what you might call the security lens. This is the view you'll often hear from Israel and its allies. For them, it's all about the right to self-defense. The main goal, from this perspective, is to dismantle Hamas so that an attack like October 7th can never, ever happen again. Then you have a totally different perspective, the human rights lens. This is the one you'll hear from groups like the UN and other NGOs. Their absolute top priority is protecting civilians right now. So they're calling for things like ceasefires, making sure aid can get in without any obstacles, and holding everyone accountable for breaking those rules of war we just talked about. All right, a third way to look at this is what we'll call the Palestinian rights lens. This view says, hey, you can't just look at October 7th in isolation. It frames the current violence as a direct result of these long-term problems. Decades of military occupation, that ongoing blockade of Gaza, and the fact that the issue of displaced Palestinians has never been solved.
Then there's the regional realpolitik lens. This one zooms way out. It sees this war as just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, a power struggle across the entire Middle East. This is where you start looking at the role of countries like Iran and its support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And it's also where you analyze the tricky diplomatic dance being done by mediators like Qatar and Egypt.
And finally, the fifth lens, accountability. This is the viewpoint pushed by legal experts and institutions like the International Criminal Court. The core argument here is pretty simple. Without real impartial justice for the war crimes allegedly committed by everyone involved, this cycle of violence is just going to keep repeating itself over and over again.
So where does all this leave us? You've got this massive human cost, these completely different ways of seeing the problem. It raises the biggest question of all. What happens next? What are the possible ways out of this?
Well, generally, people are talking about three main paths forward. And let me tell you, none of them are simple. First, there's the idea of a sustained ceasefire, but that's all tangled up in these incredibly difficult and fragile negotiations over the hostages. Second, there's the goal of demilitarizing Gaza, but that immediately opens up a huge can of worms. Who would be in charge after Hamas is gone? And third, you have the big one, a real long-term political solution. But that means finally dealing with the root causes of the conflict, a diplomatic effort that's basically been stuck in the mud for years.
And that really brings us to our final thought, a question for you to take away. As you watch the news, as you read articles, think about this. Which of those 5 lenses are being used? Which one do the sources you trust tend to favor? Because here's why it matters so much. The way a story is framed, it doesn't just change how we feel about the war, it fundamentally shapes what we think is possible. It determines which solutions seem reasonable and which ones seem completely off the table.